Buenas noches a todos. Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for being here for this talk. I'm going to be moderating this talk with mostly artists, but also a cultural worker from Mexico. Some of them live in Mexico. Some of them are just arrived to study here art in Chicago, and some others have been here for a while and they are U.S. citizens. So yeah, maybe before talking about the relationships between Mexico and Chicago, the art scene here, the art scene there, how is it that Mexican art is understood maybe these days, or how is it that or if it's necessary to say, for example, if you are a Mexican artist here or just an artist, or how those kind of things work. I'm just want to ask you, you all to present a little bit yourself and talk a little bit of your work. We have Cecilia Beaven from Mexico City, who is in the art school right now in an MFA program. We have with us also Edgar Cobian, who is an artist based in Guadalajara, Mexico. Ken is going to be here with us also for translation issues. Thank you, Kenny. And whatever you want to say, of course, welcome. Tenemos a Livia, also Livia Biani. Biani, sorry, yeah. And she just finished an art administration in the School of the Art Institute. And well, we have also Salvador Jimenez Flores here with us, who is now teacher indeed of the same school. And well, maybe it's better if you begin to talk about what you do, your interests, your works, and then we can have a conversation. Thank you.
Should I start?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Cecilia. I'm a visual artist. I usually work in painting and drawing, and I also really enjoy big-scale projects. So I've done some murals in Mexico and in the US. I am based in Chicago right now because I'm doing an MFA at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, an MFA in painting and drawing. But I only came for that, so I would say I'm still more like from Mexico. That's my work behind me. That's like recent. That one is sold. I just brought like a mixture, like a little bit of everything. That's a self-portrait. Yeah, so I guess I'm in this student status right now, but before that I was producing in Mexico. That's it.
Hola, buenas noches. I'm gonna speak in Spanish, sorry. Yo soy artista visual, especializado en pintura, pero actualmente trabajo en diferentes medios y formatos, pintura, escultura, fotografía, video, instalación y sonido.
You might have to repeat a little bit, so sorry about that. This is the first time. But so I'm a visual artist who focuses more on digital work. Disculpe, ¿puedes repetir un poquito?
Diferentes medios.
Different mediums, but focusing on painting.
Escultura,
sculpture, painting. Installations, and like audio and sound art.
Las imágenes que estamos viendo son de algunos de mis proyectos más recientes.
These images are from the most recent work that he's been doing.
Como podrán ver, son trabajos entre escultura, objetos. En sí, todo mi trabajo de alguna manera aborda como temas importantes como desde
So this is, yeah, sorry. So this is like different, this art he's been doing is with sculpture, a different medium, and all the work that he does is with different like important themes that he has.
Desde, digamos, una postura crítica hacia ciertas cuestiones de la cultura y la política, pero desde una visión, digamos, como bastante personal.
So talking about different cultural and political questions, but on a very personal level.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Livia, and I don't have images because I'm not a visual artist. I am an arts administrator, basically. I work for Arts Alliance Illinois right now, doing special projects and operations. But during my time in Chicago, I've been in the School of the Art Institute of Chicago conducting my own research on questions about how indigeneity is being used or represented both in museum and artist work and in broader terms in cultural policy from the Mexican government. So my questions always rely on when is something appropriation and when something is artistic license and when something is cultural exchange and something else can be exploitation.
And hello, this is some of my work. So I think this is kind of like where, like the way I see my work, it's more like a time machine. Like I like to go back and forth and you know, navigate these two worlds, the past and the present. And then I try to make this artwork, and hopefully with that I can try to get a sense of where we're heading with the future. And for me, this were like the three main arguments. Like, what does it mean to be a Mexican national, U.S. citizen, and the double consciousness that's created. So this body of work was based on that type of note, and kind of like playing with the idea of multiples, but also thinking about all the labels and stereotypes that are assigned to Latinos living in the United States, and how can I use this mold as a way of exploring identity through those works. And also having fun, right? Like making it political, but having fun. And then after that, I was interested in trying to develop this aesthetic that I call Rascuache futurism. And for that, I look into pre-Columbian art. And this is when I was at the Harvard Ceramics program, and I was able to explore some of those artifacts, or literally they're art objects. And I was trying to like understand like what it was like to, you know, be them in that time. So I try to implement some of those techniques. And then with that, I started to develop this body of work that is more of a hybrid, and using the cactus as a form of, as a metaphor of resilience. And then also implementing this idea of futurism. So it's like a springboard from Afrofuturism, and how can I play with this two different worlds, right? But essentially for this one, it was more with the idea of creating my own future and thinking about, like after all this chaos, like the people who have been resisting all this oppression are kind of the ones that are more likely to survive. So that's where that body of work is taking me, and once again, it's still questioning the idea of identity through these works, and the complexities of colonialism and all the transgeneral trauma that exists. That's it.
Well, thank you so much. Now we have a bigger idea of what you do and your interests. And yeah, I maybe want to just begin these conversations asking you, Salvador and Cecilia, also what is it to be like an artist or a Mexican artist right now in the state? I mean, you, as someone who just like came, who has been here for 1 year and a half, and who, for example, I see that you don't use, for example, like an iconography related to Mexico, but for example, I've seen that you have some mural works, but which are not really related, like to the Mexican muralism. And yeah, how is it like for you being here as someone who just arrived to study, being from Mexico, and for you, Salvador, as someone who had been here like for 2 decades, or I mean, so yeah, how is it? Is it always like being like a Mexican artist, for example, or you can be just an artist, or how does it work here? Because I feel that you use, for example, an iconography related to the pre-Hispanic or the Mexican icons, symbols. So yeah, I don't know if we could talk a little bit about that, and also or maybe we can begin with that. Yeah, for Livia, I was also thinking, yeah, how do you work with a lot of indigenous communities? So I just wanted to know, for example, how do you see the relationship between contemporary art and the relationship they have with these communities, or how is it, or how they are represented or not in contemporary art, or different projects you have in mind? Maybe you can share some of your experience. Y Edgar, also, yeah, how do you see, like, as an artist who is based in Guadalajara and Mexico, how do you feel, or how do you see the scene in the States, and in which way your work is critically political and critic in terms of culture? So yeah, maybe that's only to begin with, and I know it's a lot, but yeah, maybe it's like many open questions, so we can have a dialogue.
Well, for me, one thing that I do take from Mexican culture are the myths. I'm very interested in mythology, and that's not only in Mexican mythology, but in general. But I do look and have looked a lot at the Aztec mythology, and that's something that I take for my work. You cannot tell in my work, maybe right away, but there are references, and I guess that's a conversation that I like to have with people if they want to, and if they see it in my work, or if they're interested to know. But I'm not interested in doing work that explicitly looks Mexican, and that people read right away as Mexican. But one thing that has been interesting about living here is that I think of myself as Mexican all the time, which is something that didn't happen before. Of course, when I was in Mexico, I was not thinking of myself as Mexican. I mean, I was obviously, but not like that was not like something that I had in my mind most of the time. And in here, of course, I do. And then these questions become like questions that are part of my practice every day. And every decision becomes very conscious. If I want to represent something, like why, and it just becomes very heavy. While in Mexico, I feel like my creative decisions maybe were more free. Yeah.
So yes, like a kind of weight, you can say, or.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a weight, but it's also good. I feel like it has been good to reflect on my nationality and cultural identity, and whether I want it to be part of my work or not, and is it important or not. Those are questions that I work with every day, so I don't have a definite answer for that.
I think for me, in a similar note, actually I didn't grow up like saying like, oh, I'm gonna be an artist, or I'm an artist. For me, I think art was more of a coping mechanism when I migrated to the States, because I didn't know English at all. And then I had to go to high school, and there was a lot going on coming from a small town to a big city like Chicago. I couldn't process all that change. And it was through a photography class that I was able to find the power that exists within the visuals. And through that, I went to drawing, and then became a graphic designer, and became interested in teaching, and all of a sudden that kind of like took over. But I think the reason why my work is heavy on identity, part of it is just understanding these two worlds that I navigate, and I'm trying to reconcile with those two things, and kind of like see where I fit in within this world. And I think I'm interested to see what would happen if I were to move back to Mexico, and how my work there might change completely just because of the context. Here, this is kind of like what I'm influenced by my surroundings, and if I were to live somewhere else, maybe that would change. And I think even with this latest body of work that is leading more towards Rascuache futurism, I'm trying to break away from my own, I guess, category per se, and then try to explore more, I guess, a broader venue. And I'm interested to maybe even get to abstraction at some point, and how can my work get from where it's now to abstraction, and then I'm interested too in the lack of representation of Latino artists in institutions. So now looking back, I'm seeing how, in a way, I'm using this as a strategy just to open up the doors, and then I can really present whatever I want that doesn't have to evolve around the idea of identity. So.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I don't think I'm ready to answer what you asked me, but rather I have a question for both of you, and Esteban also, because you were the curator for the show at Sector. And I think that my inability to answer that question, any question right now, is because I feel like there are very different assumptions of what it means to be Mexican, which of course is a question that everybody has grappled with. But at the same time, I feel like I'm interested in hearing how you are owning that label or rejecting it. Like, what is it symbolizing for you? Because Cecilia, you mentioned something about looking Mexican, and for you, it's like very much part of your identity. And the show at Sector is not explicit about identity; it's more of a connection that the artists share. And yet when I'm embedded in a conversation that is asking me about Mexicanness, all I can say is that I very actively reject that label, because there is an assumption that Mexican, or rather the concept of being Mexican, eliminates the particularities of indigeneity, because both in Mexico, and I'm not sure if here in the United States, that might be something that you can elaborate, but there is an assumption that we're all mixed, so we're all indigenous in a way. And those kinds of experiences do change the more you pull away from urban centers like Mexico City, or even class-based. Like in Mexico City, there are a lot of indigenous communities that live there, that work there, just as Chicago. Like Chicago, there are a lot of people from my hometown that live here. But the point is that where do we drag the line of when something feels Mexican and when you just have to be part of the label because everybody else is just throwing it out there?
Yeah, that was a long question. Yeah, well, what I was saying is that right now, I don't feel the urge or desire at all to make my work look Mexican. I take some Mexican elements that I am interested in, which are all from mythology, just because I really enjoy narratives and storytelling, and these are stories that come from the place where I come from too, so I feel identification with them. But I don't want my work to look Aztec, you know? I use my own style, whatever that is. I don't know, can you tell me more of your question?
No, I mean, I don't think there's an answer. It's just like a perception. Like, I have my own very particular views of being Mexican, and I think that Mexican is just, for me, it's a way of erasing histories and realities that are very present in Mexico, and that eliminate the conversation of what it means to be intersectional in Mexico, or what it means to acknowledge other identities within the Mexican spectrum.
Right. Yeah, I guess, yeah, when I think about that, I think I've become more interested in my own like specificity, which is yeah, way more particular than being Mexican. Being Mexican is maybe a category that I just happen to fall into, but within that there are several others that I also fall into, like just being a woman, being from Mexico City, having this skin color, but dark hair. Or, I don't know, there are many other things, or the class that I belong to, like middle class, and the professions of my parents. Like there's so many other things that make me specific and like individual. And I guess I focus more on that. And being Mexican is part of my identity, but I don't feel like it's the only thing that defines who I am.
And I think for me, it's just kind of like the whole idea, right? Before anything else, I'm human, right? And then after that, I decided to be an artist. So there comes all these identities of being an artist, all these little things that come with that. Who happens to be from Mexico, living in the States, making work. So that's already like a lot of material that I can play with for my artwork. But I also don't think that we necessarily have to do art about identity. Like, and I think sometimes that's what happens sometimes in schools. Like you're in school and then you try to have a critique about your work, and one, they don't know how to talk about work that deals with identity because they think it's too personal and they just don't. Some professors are uncomfortable talking about that work, but then also they push people of color to make work about their identity. And I think that's not the case. It's just like everyone's gonna make work about what they feel connected with and what they know best, right? So for me, right now I'm dealing with this and I'm making work about that. Maybe if my life changes, I'll be doing work about something else.
No, yeah, I think also that, yeah, that's the problem with using Mexico. It's a kind of contradiction as I see it, because, yeah, I do believe Mexico as a nation is like the official discourse of the nation, let's say, has erased, for example, not our glorious past with the indigenous past, like our Aztec classic Greece, let's say. But now these days, yeah, there is like Mexico is not like considering like not acknowledging maybe all the richness of all the different cultures which live inside Mexico, because Mexico, yes, like this modern nation with this glorious past, which has no this relationship with the present indigenous. No, it's something that I feel that it's very contradictory when you think in Mexico it's so different and so plural that, yeah, saying something like this is Mexican is something like crazy in a way. But at the same time, the contradiction is that maybe, as you said, when you are here in the States, then from a moment to another, you become like Mexican, no? And you are like under a certain label, which is the Latino or the Mexican, and that's a kind of contradiction because, yeah, of course, those are labels which are never going to be accurate and which are deeper than they are just as a label. But at the same time, something that I feel that happens here, which is also different from being in Mexico, is that there are the ways in which identities are performed and which certain groups are labeled is like much more different than what happens in Mexico. So yeah, I don't know how is your perception, Edgar, of these kind of things. Also, like someone who not only you are not from Mexico City, but from Guadalajara. So I don't know how you see these relationships, not only between Guadalajara and Jalisco and Mexico, but yeah, how do you see like being here, for example, just for this time?
Yo quisiera hablar un poco acerca como de esta cuestión de la identidad.
I just want to talk a little about that question about identity.
Porque creo que para mí sí es importante el hecho de que soy un artista trabajando desde México. Es algo que siempre considero en mi trabajo.
It's something really important to me that I am an artist working from Mexico. It's something that I always consider when doing my work.
Porque participando digamos en el arte contemporáneo, realmente mi trabajo sí tiene como una exhibición fuera de México, pero lo cierto es que muchas de las cuestiones que me importan son desde cuestiones muy locales o muy directas al lugar de donde vengo.
Like as a contemporary artist, I might have exhibitions outside of outside of Mexico, but it's really true that the questions that I'm answering or the things that I'm addressing are local things.
Y digo, ya sea he presentado mi trabajo aquí en Estados Unidos o en alguna otra parte del mundo, eso lo que sí es que genera algunos, digamos, como problemas respecto a ciertos códigos que yo uso en mi trabajo y que de repente fuera es difícil que sean entendidos en su amplitud o complejidad.
So when I show my work, I've showed my work here in the States and in other parts of the world, and it's a little bit difficult because I'll have certain like codes in my work that might be not interpreted the same way in another place, or they might not like fully understand the breadth of those codes and what I'm trying to say.
Solo para ejemplificarlo, ahora recuerdo en una ocasión mostraba mi trabajo a un artista afroamericano y yo tengo unas piezas donde intervengo fotografías de mi familia, de mis álbumes familiares y en una...
One time, for example, I was showing my work to an African-American artist, and I have these pieces that kind of intermingle photos, like family photos.
Y eran fotografías y van acompañadas como de unos textos que son una especie como de poesías y en ellas mencionaba yo la palabra negrito porque en mi infancia siempre fui como el negrito de la clase.
And so they were photos of like there were these photos intermixed with this poetry, and one of the words that was there was negrita, and that's a word that was always used kind of when I was a child. That's what people would call me. I was always considered that.
Y él de alguna forma le resultó como ofensivo porque desconocía que eso sucedía en México. Y sentía que yo estaba como metiéndome en algo que desconocía o que no me correspondía.
And the artist was offended at the use of that word and kind of didn't quite, because it was used in this context of Mexico, it was like, that's a different thing than it is used here. And so there was kind of that miscommunication and they seemed to be offended.
Digo, eso lo mencionaba como para explicar eso que hablo de los códigos que siempre que un trabajo, o en mi caso, mi trabajo cuando se muestra en otros espacios, siempre resulta que hay estas cuestiones como de códigos que no se pueden leer del todo.
And so I only mention that because it's an example of kind of these codes that I use when my work is interpreted outside of, outside Mexico, that there's always going to be those kind of differences, that those codes might be kind of seen differently.
And he was an artist from the United States. Yeah, okay. So yeah, I think that's interesting because it's related to the fact, I don't see how do you see here that have been for a longer period. I think, I don't know, maybe you can talk of the Mexican experience, but also of the experience of being here and the role played by identity in art. Maybe, I don't know how you see that. I know it's a very open question, but yeah, I think thinking on the context of Mexico and thinking on the context of the city, for example, what is the role of the identities in art? If you can speak a little bit about
The idea of art and identity here in the States?
Yeah.
Well, I think, for instance, another component for this conversation would be having someone who was born and raised here from Mexican parents. But then also then you have this other territory in the southwest, which is like the, you know, this land that was stolen from Mexico. And even for them, you know, they have more of a identity crisis, right? That's why they came out with the concept of Chicano, and how that was kind of like a way for them to kind of like grab a little bit of both worlds and try to make some sense of their situation. So I think, you know, when it comes to identity and making work about that in the States, I think a huge part of it is just trying to reconcile these two worlds. But I think at the end, you know, a lot of the work is still personal, and I think if people see the work with, you know, in a more open-ended questions, they can see beyond the identity, because I think the work that we do goes beyond that. It's not just limited to that. But I think it's just the kind of like the notion that just because we're Mexican artists, that they just kind of like put it in this category that it should look or address certain issues. But if you really look at the work that is being done, I mean, we're really doing work that is very contemporary, and it addresses different issues, and we work with different mediums, and not everything is, you know, it's not like a black and white, but there's all these color and gray zones in the work that we do.
I think that, I mean, not being a visual artist, I would be interested in the perception of those who are, but like a very real way that it gets experienced is through critiques in art school, right? There have been, at least I've heard plenty of complaints of it being like the role of identity in art, at least for Mexican and Mexican-American students, of it being a trap, because you can't, your work is deemed to not be likable or having an audience or be engaging if it's not addressing complex questions because of the background that you have. And at the same time, when you do approach it, you are embracing, or rather, no, when you approach it, I wonder, is it on your own terms? Like, how many of the new artists, people that are in class right now, are experiencing with this because they are being told that that's how their experience is valuable, and that's how their work can be experienced, and how much of it is because there's an honest, willing, and yeah, a willingness to engage in questions that are actually in their minds. So, I mean, you're a teacher right now at SAIC, so you probably do a lot of critiques, and I'm not sure if your students have approached you with these complaints about how critiques are usually transformed by this weight. And I mean, also for Edgar, it would be interesting to know, like, how do these people that come from elsewhere, that go where you are, when you are not outside of your country, when you are just conducting your practice in your town, like, when do these perspectives come to you and are still laid upon you, even when you're not looking, when you don't share the same audience that, like, these questions have?
Si estás en tu país, en Guadalajara, y si viene gente de afuera que están como buscando, que tiene crítica o tiene algo para decir sobre su trabajo, como siente, o...
Yo considero que, aunque trabajo dándole importancia a mi identidad y poniendo, digamos, como mostrando las problemáticas que me afectan a mí directamente, creo que al final de cuentas uno como artista lo que trata de hacer es aportar a un pensamiento general y global de la humanidad. Finalmente uno
Entonces, sorry. So as like an artist who is thinking in like his own identity, but is also thinking in these kind of these other issues that are local, I also tried to kind of work in a space that is a little bit more global, kind of touch on themes that are more global, so that their work is also received by other people.
Finalmente, cuando uno estudia y luego hace arte, uno entiende que está aportando a una conversación mayor, que es una conversación, digamos, como entre todas la humanidad en general, y ni siquiera solamente de este tiempo, sino está uno intentando conversar con el pasado también, ¿no?
So as an artist, you are trying to have that conversation. When you study art and you do art, you kind of realize it's this conversation across kind of the humanity and also kind of with the past as well.
Por lo tanto, para mí, lo que pueda pensar la gente de otras partes sobre mi trabajo es importante. Tal vez el problema sería que esas personas que se interesan en mi trabajo o que ven mi trabajo no se involucren lo suficiente como para poder tener una lectura más completa, así como digo, como lo hacemos nosotros, por ejemplo, cuando estudiamos, no sé, el trabajo que cuando entendemos el trabajo que se produce en otras partes, ¿no?
So like when it's a little bit like, so when you have kind of, you're there and you're studying work from other people as well, you do have those people who come in and they take an interest in your work, and so they are trying to learn about your work in that way.
Oh, well, also in this talk about the name, I think it's like Mexican contemporary art. Yeah, I wanted to also ask you all in which way you consider your work is contemporary, and also, yeah, some has argued that now the relationship between the center and the periphery has changed, that there are no more like these centers of power of production and who are the one like dictating what is happening in the art world, and some say that it's much more, there is like much more fluidity. And with this in mind, I don't know if you have, if you believe that this is true, and also what is your experience like moving elsewhere and having this possibility of having like two cultural references or more in your experience in what you do? I don't know if that was clear or, yeah? Yeah.
Well, I was thinking again about specificity and what you said, Livia, about like how being Mexican is like an ambiguous term and it like eliminates some people. And then connecting that to your question, I guess I do see like a big cultural impact of the Mexican culture in my work, but maybe it's a very specific part of that culture, and not what people here usually associate with Mexican. So I don't use wrestlers or skeletons or any kind of cacti or, you know, things that people would associate with Mexican in my work, but I do think about Mexican food every day, like all the time, and I'm sure that that filtrates into my work, and the colors of the neighborhood where I lived before coming here and its market, and like those are things that are in my work for sure. And I feel like the way I use that without being literal maybe is very different from like how Mexican art was understood maybe like during the modernism. So I don't know if that's a contemporary approach to using my culture, but that might be an answer to that.
Looking at me. Well, I mean, for me, it's a little bit more simple, right? I'm making art right now. That makes me a contemporary artist. if they want to add more labels to it, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, to second that, I think that, I mean, a lot of times when discussing indigenous crafts, there's this effort to ascribe it some sort of weight of, like, the weight of history, like something that is eternally connected to the beginnings of culture and not the moment in which they are made, with this perception that crafts are by nature tethered to ancient iconography and ancient ways of doing things, without a realization that in this time and age, even the most rural areas of Mexico have been impacted by globalism in a way that is present in the little like bodegas that are there. Like Coke reaches everywhere, so why wouldn't mass production do too? So you have crafts that are made and that are only possibly made through ways of creation that were imported from the United States when the train tracks were laid. And so that makes them contemporary in a way that I don't believe it's recognized by the art market in any way, to a point where these cultural productions are not even regarded as art and are considered as a separate category. And even then, it can't be an effort of, I mean, there's no reason why craft has to be art, but there is no reason either why craft has to be by nature ancient, right?
Sí, digo, finalmente hablar de arte contemporáneo es digo, simplemente como digo, una forma de definir creo yo un tipo de trabajo que estaría atendiendo como las cuestiones que son importantes en este momento, ¿no?
I think, like, so talking about contemporary art is a question of talking about issues that are important in this moment.
En ese sentido, creo que mi trabajo es contemporáneo en cuanto a que creo que dialoga con lo que está sucediendo en el mundo en general y con lo que está sucediendo en el mundo del arte.
For that reason, I think my art is contemporary because I'm in dialogue and conversation with the art world in general and like the world in general.
Otra cosa que me parece importante mencionar acerca como esto de la identidad, pero creo que está y que está ligado con todo lo que hemos estado hablando, es que pienso que uno de los riesgos, digamos, cuando yo exhibo mi trabajo como mexicano fuera,
So also talking about that idea of identity that we've been talking about, when I do my work like as a Mexican,
podría ser que yo entendiera lo mexicano, digamos, como una, como una caricatura, una forma, digamos, de alguna forma como acartonada, como que creyera que por ser mexicano tiene que aparecer, no sé, cosas como el maíz o, no sé, la danza de los viejitos.
so to be like, sometimes it makes me think that to do something like that's considered Mexican, it has to be kind of like a caricature of what is Mexican, and that for your work there has to be like, you know, maíz, like corn has to come up, or like other kind of traditional, like what people consider Mexican things has to be there.
Cuando en realidad para mí o para un mexicano en esta época, en realidad mucha de nuestra cultura ha sido permeada por la cultura de Estados Unidos, y para nosotros, por ejemplo, toda nuestra infancia es ver los productos culturales de Estados Unidos. Todos crecimos viendo Friends o cualquier otra serie estadounidense.
So when actually, in reality, our culture here, or our experience here, is very tied with that of the United States. We all kind of grew up watching Friends or kind of whatever other series was on, was produced from the United States.
Por lo tanto, podríamos utilizar en nuestro trabajo, y de hecho creo que sucede, se usa, y eso no significa que no seas un artista mexicano o que no seas lo suficientemente mexicano.
And that you can use those things in your work, and that it doesn't necessarily mean you're a Mexican artist or that you're not Mexican enough in your work.
Yeah, so probably, yeah, the problematic is just to think that those labels are going to be youthful and represent something while they are like super, maybe that's something that I'm getting, I mean, I did have an idea about that, but yeah, talking maybe about like contemporary art, Mexican art, it's something super tricky, right? Because it's something that, for example, you were talking about, Livia, the division between the market of the contemporary art and, for example, the crafts in Mexico of the indigenous people. But you were also saying, Cecilia, for example, how, yeah, the contemporary work you do is not anymore related to maybe certain notions of the modernism in Mexico and the muralism and the eternal Mexico. Or you were talking on how all we are as Mexican, all we know, I don't know, The Simpsons, no, or Tom and Jerry, or we are like, there are no this kind of, oh, Mexico is this square box. And yeah, so maybe the thing we have to do is like to not trust those kind of labels, or that there are labels which have so many depths and meanings which are like difficult when they are like, this is the contemporary art, no, or this is the Mexican contemporary art. And we've been talking a lot, but maybe now it's a good time to open questions to the public or the conversation. Also, if you want to ask something to some of our guests this night or something.
Okay, so I think culturally the idea of family is really specific. So I'm wondering, are you the first artist in your family, and how does your family interpret what you do?
For
Anyone? Everyone.
No.
Or arts administrator. Creative.
Okay, I'll start. I am the first artist in my family. I guess, I don't know, it's funny because my parents were very like reluctant of the creative with my older sisters. And then I guess they saw that that didn't work because they were like rebellious or something. So then when I told them I wanted to be an artist, they were like, yeah, like you can do whatever you want. Like they kind of gave up. They're very supportive. They don't really understand a lot of things of the art world, which I guess is also a motivation for me to make my work relatable. Just like coming from a background that is not artistic, I do think a lot of people who are outside of the art world when I do my work. So I want my work to not look, I mean, to look friendly, inviting, and have many layers of meaning and in it that can lead to conversations, but also just like the top layer of it, I want it to be relatable and just like inviting.
Yo no considero que sea como el primer artista de mi familia, ya que mi padre hizo como algunas cosas, como escribir un par de novelas y dibujaba todo el tiempo, aunque no lo hizo de manera profesional.
So I wouldn't consider myself the first artist in the family. My father would do a lot of drawings. He wrote 2 novels, but he was, I don't think, never published.
Y por alguna razón mis hermanos, 2 de mis hermanos también realizan como trabajo creativo, ya sea que escriben o dibujan, aunque lo cierto es que no lo hacen tampoco de manera muy profesional, no están involucrados en...
So my brothers and sisters also are all kind of doing some kind of creative work, whether it's drawing or writing, but the same with my father, whether it's not on like a professional level.
Y creo que por esa razón para ellos es como algo muy no se lo ven como algo muy natural que esté yo involucrado en esto, aunque no le prestan demasiada atención.
So for that reason, I think it's not something that's necessarily unnatural, and they don't necessarily always pay attention because they're kind of used to it.
I think for me, I guess part of it is the connection to the craft, right? Like my aunts, they would do punto de cruz, like cross stitching. So I always saw them create these works, and they would always sit there and they would spend hours just doing this and following these patterns. And funny enough, like the patterns come from the States, right? So it's like all this very like Americana type of imagery that they were creating when I was growing up. And I think for me, my parents, they were a little like, well, you can do that on the side, but you should get like a real job, and you know, maybe you can just do that as a hobby. But and I think that's one of the reasons why I study to become a graphic designer, because I figured that I could be a creative and I can have a income and I can prove that I can sustain myself as an artist, and also pay tribute to all the sacrifices that they did to migrate to the States and leave everything behind for us to come here. And I think for my brother, my younger brother, who is also an artist, it was a little bit easier, because even though they didn't understand much, they were like, oh, it's okay, you know, they're just a little weird, but they're doing their own thing. And you know, and that would be like another side note, and how my brother, we have similar upbringings, but our work is completely different, you know. And so that just gives you a sense of what can happen with that.
Maybe someone else has another question? Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm not an artist. I mean, I ended up doing arts administration in a very weird way because I'm an art historian. But my family does have a lot of artists in it. Like one of my cousins has a very thriving practice in Mexico. His name is Demian Flores, and he is very active in like in the visual arts, painting and prints. But I'm actually curious about where this question comes from, because I know you have an art practice. So how are you understanding, is the role of like the cultural specificity of, or the cultural understanding of family, is that something that you're working with right now?
I am not going to answer that question because I'm here to hear you all. But I will say, thinking about how like culturally specific trades are passed down through like the family generations. So if your family was into construction, it's easier for you to be, you know, in that world than it is being like the first pioneer into a totally different trajectory, career path, and like being like an outlier.
Yeah, well, that's true, right? I mean, just talking from the perspective of craft in Mexico, there's that's a family trade. Your grandparent, if you do pottery, your parents did it and your grandparents did it. And it's just something that is ingrained into the fabric in such a way that actually one of the ways that the Mexican government decides to give artisans money or subsidize their work, one of the key questions is how many generations of the family have done it. Because if you learn it by yourself, that's not considered to be a craft. Like, you're not considered to be an artisan because you don't have that knowledge passed through families, like you were saying. So it's definitely an interesting thing to ponder. Yeah.
Does anybody has another question or want to ask something?
I have a question for the artist from Guadalajara. So, en español, cuando estabas mirando la televisión de la serie de Friends, ¿estaba en español o en inglés?
En inglés con subtítulos.
So the question was, when you were watching Friends, was it in English or Spanish? And he said English with subtitles.
Sí, la mayoría por ejemplo, en México, la mayoría de los productos que vemos como todo el cine de Estados Unidos, en realidad lo vemos siempre en su idioma original con subtítulos en español.
Voy a regresar un poquito al inglés, pero it kind of blew my mind. I don't know why, it just seems so obvious, but it kind of, when I heard that, it just kind of painted a picture of this, like, of course, you know, that makes sense. But that becomes this exchange and becomes this, that subject matter then becomes a Mexican subject matter. Right, but then it becomes, I don't know, it seems so obvious, but I never thought about it.
Sí, por ejemplo, sí, digo, yo siento que muchas de las manifestaciones culturales que hay justo ahora en México están, digamos, están mezcladas, ¿no? O sea, por ejemplo, en México hay hay todo un movimiento de graffiti, de rap, de hip hop. Vas a cualquier pueblo y toda la gente usa cachuchas del béisbol. Todos mis primos, en realidad, bueno, mucho de mi familia en realidad ha vivido mucho tiempo en Estados Unidos y todo el tiempo hay como digamos, como un intercambio cultural y digamos, eso es algo que, por ejemplo, en mi trabajo sí está. Yo siento que puedo utilizar esos códigos, aunque filtrados, ¿no?
And that's something that happens a lot with all these cultural manifestations that we have in Mexico. Like graffiti is very popular, hip hop is very popular. You can go to kind of any town and you'll see people with like the baseball hats that are all kind of from, you know, referencing the United States. And that there's always this kind of exchange and kind of mix, and that's something that's found its way into his work.
So well, maybe we have time for one last question.
How, as an artist, you see the cultural, how in Mexico, what you see in Mexico City is happening with the art? It's something that is reflecting what we're seeing on the news about the cartels and about all these 43 students' death. What do you think about it? You're working about some of these things in your work, or just something that is not in your? I mean, we talk about identity, and so I'm quite like want to know what you think about what's going on in the political world in Mexico.
I'll be brief. Like, I think for me, some of those issues are really relevant and I can connect with them. But if it's not something that I'm too familiar with, I'd rather not do work about that. Like, I think whenever I make work, I try to keep it authentic in the sense that it's something that I understand and that I have a personal connection, rather than try to cover too much without, kind of like diluting the message, because I'm not as connected. But when it comes to any way of advocating or supporting those causes, and if there's something that I can provide with skills or things, I'm more than happy to do it. But for me, sometimes it's just hard to really connect because I'm not there, I'm not experiencing that. So my lens is completely different than the people who are actually experiencing that.
My work is not political, and I don't include any kind of political critique in it. I guess I keep both identities separate. I went to vote in Mexico, I go to the protests, I have an opinion and I talk about it with my friends and my family. I just consider it a different thing. But also I feel like just the decision of being an artist and making that a way of living, like believing in expression as a way of existing in the world has something of a political decision in it on its own?
En mi caso, sí son cuestiones con las que trabajo y que están muy presentes.
So for me, those are questions that are very present in my work.
En mi obra, aunque siempre intento hacerlo desde un acercamiento como muy personal y digamos porque creo que también cuando uno tiene como estos acercamientos a cuestiones políticas puede caer uno en cierto trabajo como digamos como panfletario o
I try to keep those questions in my work, but I think sometimes it can kind of turn itself into something that's more like a pamphlet rather than like the art that you're creating.
Y aunque digamos participo de alguna manera activamente y tengo una digamos como una conciencia política y crítica y sí intento como filtrarlo de alguna manera para que en mi trabajo pueda digamos tener una mayores como posibilidades.
So I have a very strong kind of political drive, but that I try to filter that through my work to kind of create something different.
Tener como mayores posibilidades y no solamente ser como una mención, como mencionar algo, como no sé, involucrar una imagen de alguien, no sé, asesinado por el narco o así. Trato de sí partir de esos sucesos específicos, pero ampliarlo.
So I use that to try to create more possibilities, not just necessarily like of the mention of one person who was kind of assassinated or something like that, but something that can kind of get into my work to create like something bigger.
I mean, I haven't been to Mexico in a little while, but off the top of my head, I can mention like two specific examples that relate to your question. Like with the students, like Francisco Toledo made a series of kites that were like directing, referencing that, and it's a work that has been actively been showing around Mexico, and I think it came to the Mexican Museum a couple of years ago, maybe even. So, and like, I think that everybody who's aware of his work knows that he's a very politically engaged / environmentally engaged artist who is definitely taking on those subject matters right now. And in another very famous example would be the body of work that Teresa Margolles did like several years ago, but still fairly recently, like specifically in relation like to the victims of the war on drugs. So I'm a little at a loss of like more like DIY artists or other artists that are showing right this second in Mexico City. But I think that there are plenty of people that are not shy, well, that their practices directly involved with being politically active in a very obvious way. But maybe actually that's a question also for Esteban, because you're a curator in Mexico City right now. You can tell us what's happening.
Oh, well.
No pressure.
Yeah. No, I feel that, yeah, I mean, you were talking about Teresa Margolles, no? And people who has like engaged and to try to see those subjects directly. I mean, yeah, violence is something that also it's very different in many different regions of Mexico. I mean, yeah, it's a very violent country right now, but also, for example, it being in Mexico City, no, it is not that violent that had been in Jalisco, for example, or Michoacán, or in Guerrero, which are the case of the 43, the 43 students. So, and yeah, there is like, I feel that there is like a certain renaissance of political actions in Mexico right now. Indeed, you can see that with the students and with many people that are like organizations and people who are working actively in the politics and doing like political claims. But yeah, I think that in the art world you can see like sometimes that as a subject that is going to be treated, or also, for example, I as a curator, I don't do explicitly political shows neither, but I do think, for example, in the show that we curated, that I curated here alongside Mia Lopez, who is here, we stated that as they were claiming 50 years ago, the students in the demonstration, also the imagination is a way in which you can change the world and try to imagine a kind of different world. So yeah, I would say something like that. And apart from that, I want to thank you all for coming, and muchas gracias por venir. Thank you, good night.